When you think of hexagon twists, you might think that open and closed are the only options. But that's not quite the case, and there's actually a relationship between these different twists. So, welcome to Gathering Folds. Today we're talking about general hexagon twists in the context of the number line of hexagon twists, which is my notation for how to organize hexagon twists all together. So I'm going to start out today with looking at how different choices of hexagon can interact with the same structure, the same other choices in a tessellation, and then take a look at how do you transition from one hexagon to the next if you're just looking at the twist. How does that generalize into bigger and bigger twists? How can those be used in new ways? And then we'll fold together another pattern very similar to this one, but with a larger hexagon twist on the back. So starting out, how do these different choices of hexagon impact patterns? So I'm going to go through a series of patterns here and see if you can find the difference between them. So here I'm using open hexagons on the opposite side of closed triangles in an alternating pattern. Here I'm using closed hexagons on the opposite side of closed triangles in an alternating pattern. Here, closed hexagons on the same side as closed triangles, again, alternating. And here, open hexagons on the same side as closed triangles, alternating. So I've been moving from open back, closed front, open front, but nothing else about the patterns has changed. And that's because you can plug in any size of hexagon twist into this alternating pattern and get a tessellation out. I could have said the same with open triangles, double open triangles, now that we know that that's an option. And this choice of front and back for the hexagon is not so much a separate choice from what size of hexagon as it is part of the continuum. So as we've seen in these number line videos, we do have a continuum between the back and the front. So let me demonstrate that with this grid. So I'll start with a open twist. And so here my mountain folds are coming one spacing away from the corner of the hexagon, and this will be centered exactly in the middle of the hexagon. And hexagon twists are unique among the other twist shapes, by which I'm talking about square, triangle, rhombus, etc., in that hexagons are always centered on a grid intersection. So if we zoom in here, we see I've got this open hexagon centered on a grid intersection. Now if I shift all of these folds clockwise one spacing, now my mountains are coming to the edge, or sorry, the corner of my hexagon paper, and I'm going to get a closed hexagon on the same side as that open hexagon, and I can go ahead and rotate it down or choose not to, however I wish. So that's one shift. Let's do another shift to see what happens. So now my mountain is one below the corner of the hexagon, and the valley is exactly at the corner. And that's important because remember, for the last shift, the mountain was exactly at the corner, and we got a closed hexagon. So if the valley is coming exactly to the corner, wouldn't we get a closed hexagon on the other side? We shall see. And here we are, and bringing it all in together. It's not wanting to close immediately, but we can flip the paper over and see we do indeed have this closed hexagon on this side. So this is showing that the same transition from open to closed hexagon also can move us from closed hexagon on one side to closed hexagon on the other. And I'm going to continue this transition on out, and on this side of the paper it would be counterclockwise shifts, and demonstrate how we can think about, like, if we're not doing it in the center of a hexagonal piece of paper, how can we think about how these hexagon pleats are relating to each other? So shifting out, you might expect this shift is going to move me from closed to open on this side. Again, I'm shifting all of these pleats, and I do indeed transition to an open hexagon. And bringing back the puffy star, one thing to notice here is that with each pleat, I go in one, out one, in one, out one, in one, out one, in one, out one, in one, out one. And the out one corresponds to my pleat depth. So I've got one grid spacing between the mountain and the valley of the pleat. That means I have a pleat depth of 1. So if I do that transition one more time, now my mountains are hitting 2 spaces from the corner of my grid, and on my puffy star, I'm going into out 1. So into out 1, into out 1. And as long as that's consistent all the way around, I can squash that down into this nice hexagon shape. Now, it's also possible to squash things flat when it's not consistent all the way around, but that is a topic for a different live stream. So this is a double open. So we can see each side of this big hexagon hole has 2 grid spacings, and this is the twist that we'll be using for the folding demonstration later on. So opening up again, if I shift it one more time, what do you think? Am I going to get 3 in, 1 out? And indeed, this is the pattern that we see when we are shifting our pleats. And there we go. So now I've got 1, 2, 3 in, 1 out, and I can squash that as well. So we're getting lots of space used up by this twist. And so I don't usually go any bigger than this in my tessellations, because I like to, you know, get a decent number of repeats on my paper and not spend all day gridding. Although there've certainly been projects where I had to spread the gridding out over multiple days. And a curious thing about this twist is it's the outer part of this open compound hexagon twist. So I define a compound twist as a twist on one side, and then you flip over and do another twist surrounding it so that you get tube pleats coming out. And this is a specific subtype of all of the possible stacked twists, and Miguel Gagnon's book on stacked twists is a really good resource for that. And this actually uses that triple open hexagon that we just saw over here, where if I were to puff this up, you can see it's coming in 1, 2, 3, and 1 out. So there's another way to use these extra large twists, and this can be generalized to really any of the various tessellations. So coming over to a bigger grid, this is a 32-fold triangle grid on a hexagon. We're going to fold something very similar to this, but with double open holes, double open hexagons. So we'll start with the hexagon, and since I'm using a hexagon grid, I don't need to be that, or since I'm using a hexagonal sheet of paper, and my grid lines are aligned with the edge of the paper, I don't need to be that worried about finding the center or knowing exactly how these things come in relative to the center. But I will say, and I'll bring back the double open in case you're using a triangle grid on a square, for example, that the rule for the pleats coming in to the center is very similar to the rule for how the pleats interact with the corners of a hexagonal sheet of paper. So here with my double open twist, I'll zoom in on that in a sec. Here is my center, and each pleat that comes in, and I'm just going to draw the extensions of those pleats, the mountain folds specifically, because the valleys stop at the corner of the twist. But the extensions of the mountain folds are all 2 spaces away from the center. So that's what we're duplicating on our larger grid. And the way I'm going to do it with this grid is say, hey, on my right side corner, I'm going to bring up my mountain 2 spaces up from the corner, and the valley 1 spacing above that. I'm going to fold this in towards the center, but not all the way through. And then I'm going to rotate my paper to bring up the next corner and do the same there. So my mountain is 2 spaces above the corner, and my valley is another spacing above that. Zoom out slightly and rotate around. And here I can either say, okay, I'm going to duplicate that on this corner as well. Or I can start saying, okay, I see it going into out 1. So therefore, the next valley needs to hit up here. So it needs to hit here. So if the valley is hitting there, then the mountain is 1 away. And therefore, that will be my next grid line. And I can check it against the corner. It's 2 spaces away. And I want to be really firm with these lines out away from the center, but let the center be a little bit flexible. And then for the last 2, it might be easier to set them up both in the center at the same time, and then kind of gently make sure the mountain's good for both, and then get the valley in for both. Same as any other hexagon twist. Okay. So now that I've got my double open hexagon twist set up, I'm really just going to smash it from the top. I'm going to pay a little extra attention to pushing out into the corners because I am working with some smaller angles than normal between the edge of the hexagon and the valley below. But it's really going to be a smash down operation. Okay, so we said this was going to be most similar to this tessellation. So we're going to put those triangles on the opposite side at tube pleat spacing. So flipping over, and it doesn't matter how you flip because this hexagon is exactly centered. I'm going to make sure that I end up with a tube pleat on this upper side, because this lower side is actually going to be an extra spacing more than tube. If I was using an open triangle, it would be tube for both, but I'm using a closed triangle, and here we are. Then coming around, I want to come down to this lower pleat to do the next one, because I want my overlaps from this side to be unfriendly, so that when I flip the paper back over, they're friendly again. So I can either say, okay, I need this one spacing more than tube, and therefore I'm going to set my valley out here. Or I can say the corner of the triangle comes exactly to the corner of the double open hole, therefore my valley comes to there. So then the mountain is one spacing further. And the other reference you can use is to get this tube, we need the third mountain to come exactly to the tip of the new triangle. And I'm going to have a pleat overlap sitting under this triangle. Then I can finish setting up this new triangle and rotate and repeat. So valley comes exactly to the corner of the open hole, as we have seen with the previous triangles. And this one's not going to be any different because all of these triangles are going to be the same. We're in an alternating situation. So all of the triangles are the same relative to the hexagon. And here's where I'm going to speed up a little. This session is recorded, and most people do end up folding along with the recording instead of the live session. Continuing around, repeat again. And one more. This one, we don't technically need to reverse the pleat overlap that's under our new triangle, but it's going to be annoying on the other side if we don't. And there's actually two options of how to fix this. The first option is to just run through the new pleat all the way, close it, then close the old pleat. The second option is to do a compound wrap. So the reason why I originally emphasized this pleat overlap is because the compound wrap actually uses the mountains from the setup. It just releases the layers of the paper. And so I'm going to be popping into place here so that this mountain dives into the valley of the new triangle. Then there's a three-way intersection, 2 spaces from the corner of the new triangle, then another 3-way intersection, again of mountains down below, and a 3-way intersection of valleys below that. So this is a compound wrap, and it's something I didn't recognize while folding for a while, but very useful in this situation. So then I'm going to grab that compound wrap as I flip over, so we make sure that that's out of the way first, and then everything else is exactly the same. So opening that up, I want to pop this, and you can see I've got one pointy triangle. And if I was doing just a normal open hexagon, I would put my new pleat here. But I'm doing a double open triangle, and so I need to go in 2 before I come out 1. So I need to shift over 1 spacing before I lay that down. And then on this upper end, I can see that we're going to have some issues with this pleat overlap, but we'll figure it out. And we might have a little bit of extra fluffiness in the paper to get this whole hexagon in place. So I did another into out 1 to set this pleat, then into out 1 to set the next pleat, into out 1 to set the following pleat. Now notice we've got a fluffy situation here. So what I'm going to do is lay down flat this outer part of the paper and start puffing out these corners where I'm sure that I have them on a flat surface. So then I can start working my way in here and bring it up in the air to really get those next corners where they need to go. And this one's going to be the hardest. I might go in with my bone folder from the back and really emphasize where I want it to be. And notice how I'm laying this really flat, even though this space above is not flat. And I'm just going to go in with my bone folder edge by edge and make sure that that's okay. And this out here can lay flat. That's fine. Okay. So that's going to stay fluffy until we get all the way around and back to it. So I'm not even going to worry about that. And I'm also not going to fold it through here, because that would add an extra line that's going to actually be visible on both sides of the paper. So the open hexagon is the single open hexagon, like this one in the middle of the compound twist, is the only one where the grid lines line up with everything in the background. All the rest of them, not so much. Well, the closed hexagon does as well. But the closed and the open, and that's it. So now we need to come down to this pleat overlap area. And one of the things that I notice is I'm going to need a triangle out here eventually. And I see that between 2 hexagons, we get a tube pleat. So that means my valley was under here. My new valley is going to be out here, and my mountain one spacing away. So I can go ahead and set up that triangle by popping this mountain down where it hits the new valley, running that valley one spacing further out to where it hits the valley of the existing pleat, and those are going to make a three-way intersection. And we're also going to have a three-way intersection of mountains one spacing further down. So this is the triangle wrap. We can go ahead and get that set up. Just getting things cleared away so I'm free to fold my new hexagon. That was kind of the problem in here. We didn't have the previous hexagon, so we couldn't do a triangle wrap, so then it just got messy. So down in here, I can see I'm coming 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out. I'm going to continue that 2 in, 1 out. I can also use that reference like we saw in the back of these pleats being 3 spaces apart. Then I need to go 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out, and this one is going to make an accordion over the triangle wrap. Now this time everything local is flat, so I can go in and do a little bit more emphasis on smoothing out into the corners than I would with a standard open hexagon twist. Oh, make sure that pleat's in place. That would help. And at this stage, I can just leave the triangle wrap to finish up afterwards. So let's repeat those steps and continue onwards. So I'm going to use this tube as a reference. I can also say, hey, the corners of my triangles are 1 spacing out from the closed hole, so my valley needs to come 1 spacing out from the closed hole. Then I will pop the existing mountain down, run the valley 1 further, where it makes a 3-way intersection of valleys with a 3-way intersection of mountains sitting 1 spacing below it. That's my triangle wrap, and I remember from the previous twist that I'm going to have another mountain, another pleat sitting accordion style on top of it. Now I'll come in here to my pleat overlap and open it up and make sure that my new pleat running down is coming 3 spaces off from the other mountain. So on this side, the thing to remember is 2 spaces between valleys, 3 spaces between mountains. Once we flip the paper over, we change the mountain valley assignments, so then it's 2 spaces between mountains, 3 spaces between valleys. And now I have 1 more pleat to add in, and I'm looking for that 2 and 1, 2 and 1. And I've got my new hexagon twist. Coming on around, I'll repeat again. So 2 spaces between valleys. My valley is going to interrupt that mountain, go 1 spacing further and cause a 3-way intersection of valleys, 3-way intersection of mountains, 1 spacing further out. I get a accordion pleat on top of there, and then I'm going to come down to this pleat overlap, make sure that when I'm putting in my new pleat, I've got 3 spaces between mountains, and I've got that nice 2 and 1. Then 2 and 1, make sure that the new pleat is in the right grid direction, aka halfway between here and here, so here, and squash this new twist. And I should mention that I've actually never folded this particular tessellation before. This is just knowledge from the abstraction of you pick a hexagon, you pick a triangle, and then you alternate them. And then continuing around, I'm going to do the same thing again. Valleys are 2 spacings apart here. Get that triangle wrap in. Have that accordion pleat on top of the wrap. Then come down to the pleat overlap. Make sure my new pleat is 3 spaces away from the parallel mountain. And 6th pleat around the hexagon goes in 2 and 1, 2 and 1. Then I'm coming back on my fluffy part over here. So I'm going to be a little extra careful as I squash that everything is flat in the immediate area. So outside of here, it's not flat, but in this area, it is flat. And then use my bone folder to get everything nice and sharp. Okay, so coming on around here, I'm going to need 2 triangle wraps to get this set in place because we didn't do any for the first hexagon and there need to be 6 of them total. So starting with the one we usually do, get that in place. I'm going to go ahead and put my accordion pleat on top. Now, when I set up my pleat down below, that's 3 spaces from the parallel mountain, it's coming under a pleat, and I'm going to pop that pleat down and wrap it. Another way to look at this is I'm making the accordion on that first hexagon. And then I'll shift this so I can get my 2 and 1, 2 and 1, 2 in, 1 out. And now everything is flat again. And I can use my bone folder to smooth everything out. And flip over to squash my closed triangle twists that had been set up as wraps. So one thing that this tessellation is kind of suggestive of is what if we wanted to do a flagstone tiling of these hexagons? Well, the only thing you'd need to change is the spacing between the hexagon and the triangle. You would need just 1 spacing instead of these tube pleats. And then all of the hexagon corners would come to the triangle corners, which means that all 3 hexagon corners would come to the same place, and you could get a flagstone tiling of these hexagons. And actually the next series of live streams that I'm going to do is exactly on these flagstone tilings. So definitely stay tuned. If you want to get weekly reminders, head over to training.gatheringfolds.com, put in your email, and you'll join my email list of people who get reminders 4 hours before these videos. So back on the hexagon side, I want to fold my next twists. And so I'm going to somewhat arbitrarily, so I'm going to start with the pleats that are on my right hand side, and I'm going to somewhat arbitrarily say, hey, let's start up here. And so I'm going to have 2 spaces between valleys. I'm noticing this edge is not quite flat, so there we go. 2 spaces between valleys. And I'm going to do that same triangle wrap that we had seen before. And then 2 in, 1 out, 2 in, 1 out. And this pleat's coming this way. So I'm going to do another triangle wrap. And I would have an accordion over here if I had more grid. So we get off a bit easy on this time around where we're running into the edge of the grid. I mean, if it can be said to be easy with double open hexagons that are folded as partial twists, but I think it's easier to have fewer pleats to manage as we go around. So then I'm going to flip over and squash these 2 triangles that I had set up and move to another set of parallel pleats. Now, I want to move this way because I want to start with the shortest pleats of the set of parallel pleats, just kind of in general. And I want to be able to set up where my next hexagon is going to be by setting those triangle wraps on this side instead of relying on setting them up on the other side. So I know that this grid line is going to be a mountain fold because it's the same tube that we see everywhere else. So I'm going to follow that extension until it hits another mountain. Let it be a 3-way intersection of mountains. This pleat we know has to fold down this way. This pleat we know has to fold down this way because it's in the tube. And I'll let the other one lay flat on top. Notice I didn't do anything with this pleat overlap. We'll come back to that later. And then I've got the setup for my next hexagon. So I'll flip over and I need to find, okay, where is the 2 in, 1 out coming from? So we're also going to get the accordion on this if we had more grid. And I can say, oh, hey, 2 in, 1 out, that's going to be a corner. So that's more than enough information to squash this partial twist. Okay, so coming back to that triangle that we left in place, it's time to squash it. But before I do, I'm going to open up that pleat and let it be a compound wrap. So let it hang out there for a minute while I squash this twist. And then I'm going to do the same thing down below as I did up here, where I say, hey, that grid line is going to be a mountain. And it's going to come down till it intersects with this next mountain pleat, or mountain fold of the pleat at 120 degrees. Cause a new mountain, and I'll lay it down as a 3-way intersection for now, respecting the existing pleat and the tube, but letting the third direction flop over. Flipping back to my hexagon side, this is going to be an accordion over that pleat. And I need to open up this area where I had the compound wrap. And I can see corner 1, 2, 3, 4. Lots of references as I squash this hexagon. Flipping back over, we'll squash this twist and then repeat exactly how we put in the last 2 hexagons. So I'm going to find my tube, put in my next triangle as a 3-way intersection, respecting the existing pleat and the tube, but having my pleat overlap over here. Then flip over, this was going to be an accordion if I had any more grid, and then I can squash my twist. And then flip back, resolve this triangle, but before I squash it flat and lock stuff in place, I'm going to set up that zigzag compound wrap, which I use anytime there's pleats coming together at 60 degrees. So it's the two parent pleats that we're worrying about, not how they are further along. So it's this 60 degrees that I'm worrying about, not this 120 on the other side. And that's what determines if I do a normal wrap versus a compound wrap. And then I'm going to set up the tube down below, get that triangle wrap in place, flip over. It's going to be an accordion above, fluff out that compound wrap, and get my twist in place. And flip over, squash my triangle. So that was 2 repeats of the steps. Now I'll go through faster. I'm going to set up the next triangle and lay it down as a 3-way intersection, then flip over and squash my new twist. If I had more grid, I would also have another 3-way intersection out here between these 2 hexagons. Then flip over, resolve that intersection into a triangle twist, but first set up that compound wrap and squash. Then set up the triangle below. In general, with hexagons, you'll need to set up a triangle below and a triangle above. And squash. And flip and squash the triangle. 2 more edges to go. I'm going to set up the tube, which tells me where the triangle is. Leave that as a 3-way intersection with a pleat overlap. Flip over and squash. Then flip back to squash this triangle, but rearrange the pleat overlap into a compound wrap. Then come down, set up my new triangle, and I'm not squashing this one because it's very fluffy under it, and flip. Make sure that accordion is in place, open up a bit where that compound wrap is interacting with things, and squash. Flipping over, I squash my triangle, then set up the tube with the wrap, and flip, squash that partial hexagon, and make sure the valley's actually on a valley there. There we go. Or make sure the valley's actually on a grid line, I should say. And switch that pleat overlap to a compound wrap before I squash the triangle. Set up the next tube. Here I have a pleat overlap down here this time because I'm coming around to the end. And so there's extra parallel pleats there. And I can set up my new twist. And flip. And because I've got that pleat overlap there, I'll rearrange this into the compound wrap before I squash my triangle. And now there's not any space for a new triangle to be set up, but I can still say, okay, here's the tube, and open up that compound wrap a bit so that when I flip over, everything is already set up. And there we have it. Full tessellation. And it's based on triangle double bar wells with the normal open hexagons, but this is double open. And so I guess this could be called triangle double bar double open wells. Or if you wanted a shorter name for it, Beehive. So if you fold this, I do encourage you to post and use the name Beehive because, I mean, it really does look like a honeycomb pattern, and I have a different one named Honeycomb. So Beehive it is, and happy folding, everyone. I hope that you try out these larger hexagon twists. And one of the things to think about when you're folding these is, okay, if I'm folding it, what grid should I use to, for example, avoid these partial twists? And that is a question that I help answer in my project planning masterclass. It's a slightly different skill, and it mostly comes down to having a crease pattern and counting and figuring out what grid you're willing to fold. So I'll make sure to drop a link down below for both signing up for my email list and for joining the project planning masterclass, so you can have all the resources to help you fold the tessellations of your dreams. Happy folding, y'all, and I'll see you next week with the number line of rhombus twists. So one last shape in this number line series before we move on to the flagstone tilings. Happy folding. See you then.